And I honed it down to one thing, which was, in fact, that very contrary to the image that one has in the food security debate in many Asian countries that we've observed up close in the work, of food supply chains that are sleepy, backward, stagnant, many hands, extremely high transaction costs, not changing, not transforming. By contrast, in our surveys, we found huge ferment, change, rapid transformation. Not only modernization, but we also found a quiet revolution in traditional value chains. So we'll look at that, the revolution in Asian value chains and implications for farmers and consumers in a few minutes. Okay, now I can see it. First, we lay out what we think are the conventional wisdom that we've observed in many countries as assumptions in the Asian food security debate. And a couple weeks ago, we did a series of talks at Asian Development Bank, and there was a real resounding agreement about these as the assumptions, that they're sleepy, traditional, and stagnant. And where one does, in fact, observe some change, it's usually thought to be induced by direct government intervention. For example, procurement and sale of food grains. Or because there's a thought that the traditional chain is not changing, maybe export markets are changing value chains. And of course, most of the debate in Asia, beside being on rice, is on the segment of the supply chain which is at the farm level as determining food security. So we have compared those assumptions with what we found in the surveys and found them generally wrong. First of all, we found an opposite of conventional wisdom, that 95% of the food economy in Asia is domestic. Only about 5% of the food economy in Asia is related to the foreign sector, imports or exports. Okay, so that's very minor. Secondly, when you look at purchases and sales by governments of any food in Asia, it only touches 1% of the food economy of Asia. Basically, there is almost zero direct intervention in the food economy in Asia. Number three, while we found that the food price debate has been focused on the farm level, actually about 50 to 70% of the food price is formed in the post-farm gate segments of the value chain. So that intervention in productivity increases in those segments of processing, wholesale, and retail is as or more important than getting yields up at the farm level for food security in Asia. Fourth, this is interesting, about 60 to 70% of the food economy in Asia is urban. The urban market is 60 to 70% of all food eaten in Asia. Okay? And finally, which will be the rest of this very short talk, we found that far from being sleepy and stagnant, these value chains are rapidly changing. And that transformation is not just in modernization, like the rise of supermarkets, it's also traditional value chains are changing. And it's not just in high-value agricultural products. We also found in 4 big surveys, 4,000 households, that its staple food markets are changing extremely fast. And I'll show that in the 3 segments of the supply chain, downstream, midstream, and upstream. Of course, as Torero said, there is a very rapid change downstream with the rapid rise of supermarkets, thrice the speed of GDP growth, even in the fastest growing countries in Asia. And of course, this penetration has mainly been in staples and processed and semi-processed foods like dairy, etc. But there's also been a surprisingly early penetration of fresh produce markets by supermarkets in Asia, much faster than you found in the United States or in in Latin America. Okay, and we found very interestingly in a survey in New Delhi, actually and overall in Delhi, that supermarkets were charging lower prices than traditional retailers for staple foods. Okay, both in rice, atta, like processed wheat, basic vegetables, joining a general result one finds in many developing countries. Secondly, and much less researched, was that there was a very rapid change in the midstream. Now, this was observed both in modern and in the traditional parts of the midstream segments. For example, a very rapid growth and concentration in food processing, and that there was a symbiosis, a mutual support of processing sector change and retail sector change, with the supermarkets choosing large processors choosing supermarkets as buyers. We also found a rapid rise of specialized wholesalers like Bimandiri in West Java in Indonesia that work in as intermediaries between supermarkets and farmers, but also rise of third-party logistics in India that were very much related to the rise of supermarkets. And these to overcome in a fast-tracking way the procurement solutions for modern processors and retail. But also very exciting in the reaction of policymakers across the region is that we found a quiet revolution in the traditional middle segments. For example, we found a key role in a rapid expansion of the wholesale sector, extremely understudied in the whole region. And we found that within that, they themselves were transforming the supply chain by shortening it through disintermediation, cutting out the role of the traditional rural broker and cutting down the number of hands within the system. We also found in many countries, for example in India, there was a long-held belief that traditional wholesalers held in thrall in a tied output credit relationship farmers through trade. In 3,000 households of surveys, we found 2% of the farmers got any loan from traders. And we found the same thing from trader surveys, and they told us that's an old practice that's dead, that kind of tying. So in many ways, that breaking of the ties between the traditional wholesale and the farmer has been taking place over the past decade. We also found in processing sector, for example, in mills in China, that rice mills in China were branding, they were buying direct from farmers and selling direct to wholesalers and supermarkets in Beijing, packaging, and increasing in scale and changing of technology very fast, practically under the radar of research. We also found that, also very contrary to conventional wisdom, that cold storages in the potato sector in India were developing very rapidly, not just in western Uttar Pradesh near to Delhi in a commercial agriculture zone, but also in Bihar, increasing prices and payoff through storage to farmers, and that most farmers were using this cold storage. It wasn't only for the larger farmers and the better off farmers, with a definite farm price effect, and in urban areas, a food security effect. And finally, in Indonesia, emerging as a finding, and also with a survey that we did in Philippines, we found the emergence of sprayer traders who are basically intermediaries that work with small farmers to prune, spray, harvest, and market their product, thereby bringing in small farmers through this intermediation into the modern channels as well as the transforming traditional channels. Finally, upstream in the farm sector, all of this has been having an effect upstream, as we found at the farm level, rapid quality differentiation of product and changes, for example, in hybrid adoption, very rapid intensification, for example, through the uptake of herbicides, pesticides, and new seeds. And also we found, for example, that land rental markets were booming. Half of the land was rented by the farmers in the northern rice area that we studied in our rice supply chain study in China. 40% of the land rented by the farmers that we studied in western and central Uttar Pradesh in India. The land market's booming. Very interesting is that we found also that water markets were booming. But what happened is that 80% of the subsidized tube wells sold by the government of India, or dispersed by the government of India, went to medium and large farmers, who then sold most of the water that the small farmers used to them in a burgeoning water market. So in a sense, inequality of access to subsidized tube wells created a very active water market in both western and central Uttar Pradesh. And finally, echoing a point, very important point that Maximo said, is that contrary to the image one finds over and over and over again in the capitals of Asia, that when you look out at the farm sector, it's all little tiny farmers, all basically the same. We found huge differences, large heterogeneity. For example, in Uttar Pradesh and Madhya Pradesh in India, we found the 30-70 rule. 30% of the farmers are selling 70% of the grain. And in other words, there was a lot of small farmers, but the market itself was dominated by medium and larger farmers. And there was very large differences among these farmers. Even in areas where there wasn't much land difference, there was very large non-land asset differentiation. And we found that in some areas that there was exclusion of small farmers, not based on their having small farms, but rather that they didn't have irrigation or greenhouse or education or some kind of crucial access to a non-land asset that would allow them to participate in these new markets. We also found, of course, big changes in input supply in terms of the rise, for example, rural business hubs in India, consolidation of inputs with branding, and a ferment of change in the irrigation, seed, and tractor sectors. Conclusions. Far from sleepy, the food security situation is being determined little by little over time in Asia by food supply chains and a food economy that's changing very rapidly. Could be changing as rapidly as the climate or faster, with ferment and churning. And it's not just modern sector that's imposing itself, it's also a traditional sector that's changing very fast, and they're competing with each other. These have implications for consumer food security. It seems like food industry transformation helps food security in Asia. And secondly, farmers' incomes go up, but there's evidence of some exclusion of farmers getting involved because of either land or non-land assets or both. Finally, to bring into the debate a systems perspective that's been a cry of people over time is now renewed in its importance after the food crisis. Not just looking at the farm sector, the farm segment, but looking at the whole chain and, in fact, the post-farm sector segments that form more of the food price and therefore more of the food security for consumers in Asia than just the farm level segment, to bring all of that onto the table as an important, and to realize in this process that the government, even though it has almost zero role directly in these food supply chains, has a very important role in its indirect activity, for example, in power grids, in investing in cold store facilities, in helping to facilitate the growth of both modern supply chains and traditional supply chains. Thank you very much.